In the closing years of the 1930s, the world watched the sky with a new kind of fear. Bombers had turned distance into an illusion. Once they slipped past fighters and into range of a city or a naval task force, there was almost nothing defenders could do except fire blindly and hope one shell burst near enough to matter. Anti-aircraft gunners filled the air with steel, yet most explosions bloomed far from their targets. A near miss was still a miss, and every passing second brought an enemy bomber closer to the moment it released its cargo. Artillery crews understood the harsh arithmetic. To bring down a single aircraft with traditional timed shells, they sometimes needed thousands of rounds. Each shell required a carefully set delay, adjusted by hand while the gun roared and the sky darkened with smoke and fear. Even with perfect calculations, a bomber flying a slightly different speed or altitude could make all that effort meaningless. The idea of a shell that could sense its proximity to a target had existed in theory, but it felt more like a dream than a weapon. No component was small or sturdy enough to withstand the violence of being fired from a naval gun. Most experts quietly agreed that such a device might belong to a distant future, not the present chaos building across the world. Yet as the 1940s approached, pressure mounted. Europe slipped deeper into conflict, and the Pacific edged toward flames of its own. Every nation raced to outpace the next in weapons and machines. In laboratories scattered across the United States, small teams of physicists and engineers faced a growing truth. The old methods of defense were failing. Something radically different was needed, something that could turn guesswork into precision. The seeds of a new idea had been planted long before the war, but now they began to glow with urgency. Somewhere in that atmosphere of dread and innovation, a few scientists started looking at radio technology not as a communication tool but as a trigger. They studied how a simple radio wave behaved when it met a solid object, how it bounced back, and how that tiny reflection could be turned into a signal. It was a fragile concept, barely more than theory. But in a world collapsing into fire, even fragile concepts had to be chased. And in one quiet laboratory, far from the roar of guns, the first spark of a weapon that would change the course of the war had just begun to form. Far from the coasts and the roar of guns, another kind of battle began inside quiet brick buildings and cramped laboratories. In those rooms the air smelled of hot solder, machine oil, and chalk dust. Oscilloscopes glowed softly in the half-dark. Coils of wire and glass tubes lay scattered across benches. Here, the new weapon would not be forged in steel first, but in ideas. One of the central figures in this hidden front was a physicist named Merle Tuve. He had built his career studying the upper atmosphere and cosmic rays, subjects that rarely produced headlines. Yet that background had given him a rare familiarity with high voltages, electronics, and measurement under extreme conditions. When war demands arrived, he did not step into uniform. Instead, he was asked to do something that sounded almost contradictory. He was to make delicate radio equipment strong enough to survive the brutal violence of a naval gun. Skepticism surrounded the assignment from the beginning. Experienced ordnance experts had watched what happened when a shell was fired from a large-caliber gun. Inside the barrel, the projectile was slammed with a shock thousands of times stronger than gravity. Heat and pressure rose in an instant. Steel bodies shook and flexed. Even the best mechanical fuses sometimes failed under that kind of punishment. The idea that a slim glass vacuum tube could be fired this way and remain intact seemed almost absurd. Still, the problem was too important to ignore. Conventional anti-aircraft fire was simply not good enough against fast and determined pilots. So a special group of scientists and engineers assembled under wartime authority, often referred to as Section T, with Tuve playing a leading role. Their mission was narrow but extremely ambitious. They needed to create a small, self-contained radio device that could sit in the nose of a 5-inch shell, survive launch forces roughly 20,000 times gravity, sense an aircraft nearby through reflected radio waves, and trigger an explosion at just the right moment. The constraints stacked up quickly. The fuse had to be small enough to fit inside existing ammunition with only limited changes to production lines. It had to contain a power source that would come to life in flight, not during storage. It had to be reliable enough that a fleet could trust it in combat, yet cheap and simple enough for mass production. Most of all, it had to work in less than a second, while the shell screamed upward toward its target. In the early months, the work progressed more like a series of failures than a smooth development. Test shells were fired and recovered when possible. Often, nothing inside survived. Glass shattered, solder joints cracked, coils were crushed or burned. Then small details began to change. Tubes were redesigned with thicker glass, shorter internal parts, and stronger supports. Components were mounted in shock-absorbing materials. Circuits were simplified so there were fewer things that could go wrong when everything was shaking. Another challenge involved power. The fuse needed electricity, but batteries could not be allowed to leak, discharge, or explode in storage. Engineers explored dry cells that would only become active under the spin of the shell or the stress of launch. They devised clever ways to arm the fuse only after it had traveled a safe distance from the gun, so that a malfunction would not destroy the weapon that fired it. As these technical details slowly came together, the group had to prove their progress to skeptical military observers. Demonstrations were arranged on isolated test ranges. Gun crews loaded shells fitted with the new devices and fired at small target aircraft flown by remote control or towed by cables. At first, many of these attempts failed in unimpressive ways. Some shells detonated too early or too late. Some simply behaved like ordinary timed rounds, their radio circuits silent or broken. Yet every failure added data. Fragments were collected. Broken parts were studied under magnification. Electrical traces were examined back in the laboratory. Each report went into growing stacks of notebooks. Gradually, patterns emerged in the chaos. The team learned exactly which vibrations caused tube filaments to snap, which acceleration profiles stressed the fragile glass the most, which solder joints gave way under shock. Outside the laboratory walls, the war accelerated. News arrived of cities under attack, of convoys shattered by air raids, of ships lost to sudden dives out of the clouds. This constant stream of reports added pressure, but it also hardened the resolve of the scientists. For many of them, this was their battlefield. Their tools were slide rules and test stands rather than rifles, but they understood that the outcome of their quiet struggle could shape events on oceans and continents they might never see. As the experiments improved, a new problem appeared. The device worked well enough in controlled trials, but war was not controlled. Real battlefields were full of smoke, clouds, rain, and interference. The fuse had to be able to distinguish a real aircraft from ground reflections, waves, and bursts of other shells. Circuits were refined so that they responded most strongly to targets at certain distances, rather than triggering at the nearest random reflection. This demanded endless cycles of adjustment and retesting. The process was slow by the standards of the front lines, but fast by the standards of peacetime science. What might have taken many quiet years was compressed into a few intense ones. People later described those days as a blur of test shots, late nights, and constant redesign. The scientists were not trying to win prizes or publish papers. They were racing a clock measured in casualties. By the time the first truly dependable prototypes emerged, something else had changed. The personnel in the program were no longer asking whether such a fuse was possible. They were asking how quickly it could be produced in numbers that mattered. Blueprints were cleaned up and simplified. Instructions were written for factory workers who would never see the laboratories where the designs had been born. The project was now ready to leave the narrow world of experimental physics and enter the sprawling world of wartime industry. What remained was the most unforgiving test of all. The new fuse would have to prove itself not against canvas targets and dummy aircraft, but against real enemies flying real attack runs. The ocean, and the ships that crossed it, were waiting. By the time the new fuse left the laboratories, the war in the Pacific had entered a harsh and uncertain phase. The struggle for the Solomon Islands had turned warm water into a graveyard of ships and aircraft. Night battles raged between cruisers and destroyers, while daylight brought the constant threat of dive bombers and torpedo planes. Every ship that steamed into those waters knew that the real danger often appeared as a dark speck high above the horizon. Among the vessels sent into this environment was a sleek light cruiser named Helena. She carried 12 rapid-firing 5-inch guns guided by radar and advanced fire control equipment for the time. Her crew had already been hardened by earlier actions. They had watched enemy aircraft plunge toward their formation more than once, and they knew how easily a single bomb could change the fate of a ship. Now they were given something new to load into their magazines, a device whose true nature was known only to a handful of officers and technicians. The new shells did not look dramatically different from ordinary ammunition. The nose sections were more complex inside, packed with miniature electronics instead of simple mechanical parts. On paper they were described in careful, understated language as variable-time fuses. In reality, they represented years of compressed research and an enormous gamble. If they worked, they could transform the ship's anti-aircraft battery into a far more deadly shield. If they failed, they would be just another kind of timed shell, no better than the ones already in storage. Fear of enemy intelligence shaped every step of their introduction. Instructions stressed that these rounds were to be guarded closely. Crews were told not to let intact examples fall into enemy hands if it could be avoided. The first combat trials were arranged far from crowded home ports, in waters where any dud that splashed down would likely vanish into the depths without being recovered by observers on the other side. For the Helena and the ships around her, this meant that their first use would come in a very real and unforgiving arena. In the opening days of January 1943, American transports and escort ships gathered near Guadalcanal to support operations on the island. Enemy forces understood the importance of these ships and prepared airstrikes to disrupt the flow of men and supplies. The sea was not calm in a political sense. Both sides knew that control of this patch of ocean could tilt the wider campaign. Radar screens and lookouts watched the sky with an extra level of attention. On the 5th of January, word came that enemy aircraft were inbound. Radar detected them first as distant traces creeping toward the formation. The alert passed quickly through the cruiser. Gun crews moved to their stations with practice speed. Ammunition handlers brought up the new shells for selected mounts, mixing them with more traditional fused rounds. There was no time for ceremony. This was not a demonstration range but a live attack, and the margin for error was thin. As the range closed, the Helena's fire control systems began to track the incoming planes. Calculators whirred, gears turned, and pointers swung across dials. The gunners elevated their barrels toward the predicted points in the sky where the aircraft would soon appear. Other ships in the group prepared their own batteries. The noise level rose as engines revved and blowers roared, but beneath the machinery there was a sharper tension. For the first time, the new fuses were about to face targets that shot back. When the enemy aircraft finally came into visual range, they arrived not as vague concepts but as real machines cutting through the sky. Japanese dive bombers and possibly their escorts approached with intent sharpened by months of fierce fighting. Their plan was simple. They would push through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire, commit to steep attack dives, and drop bombs onto the vulnerable ships below. They had done it before, sometimes with devastating effect. Then the guns opened. The Helena's 5-inch mounts began firing in carefully timed sequences, each blast shoving a new shell upwards along a calculated path. Some of these shells carried conventional timed fuses. Others carried the compact radio devices that had been tested so relentlessly on hidden ranges. As they left the muzzles, their internal parts came alive. Power sources engaged. Oscillators began to send out tiny radio signals. Receivers listened for returning echoes from anything large and solid in their path. Observers on the cruiser and nearby ships watched the first bursts appear in the sky. They were used to seeing shells detonate at altitudes where they had been set, often slightly ahead or behind the enemy planes. This time, some of the explosions seemed to cling more closely to the silhouettes of the attackers. Clouds of shrapnel erupted not in empty air, but in places where wings and fuselages were about to be. The difference was subtle in the first seconds, but it was there. One of the Japanese dive bombers pressed in toward the formation, intent on finding a vulnerable target. It flew through what must have seemed like familiar fire. Yet among the usual bursts, a new shell closed the gap with unusual precision. Its fuse sensed the change in reflected radio energy as it neared the aircraft. In a fraction of a second, the device reacted. The explosive charge detonated not on contact, but at a calculated distance that maximized its effect. From the ships below, the result was stark. The bomber was suddenly engulfed in a violent airburst, fragments slashing through its structure. Instead of completing its dive, it broke apart, trailing smoke and debris as gravity took hold. It fell toward the sea without releasing any bomb that might have struck the vessels clustered beneath it. To witnesses who understood what had been loaded, this was not just another kill. It marked the first time in combat that such an airburst, triggered by a proximity fuse, had brought down an aircraft. The attack did not end with that single moment. Other planes continued their runs. Guns on Helena and the rest of the formation kept firing, filling the air with more shells and more bursts. Yet the psychological balance had shifted slightly. The defenders now had evidence that their new weapon could do what had been promised. The attackers, though they could not yet know the technical details, had encountered a field of fire that behaved differently from what they were used to. After the raid, when the guns fell silent and only the faint smell of powder lingered over the decks, the facts of the day began to settle. Reports would later describe the accuracy of the bursts and the number of aircraft damaged or destroyed. Technical officers would note how the new fuses had performed in varied conditions of altitude and approach angles. Messages summarizing the action would travel back across thousands of miles to those who had designed and approved the program. In that exchange between distant laboratories and a cruiser at sea, the weapon earned its place. The ideas that had once lived as sketches and formulas had now drawn real blood in the sky over the Solomon Islands. The Helena's quiet role in that transformation marked only the beginning. Other ships would soon receive their own supplies of the new fuses, and the scale of their impact would grow far beyond a single day's fight. Once the proximity fuse had proved itself over the Pacific, the struggle around it shifted again, this time from the world of research to the world of industry. Laboratories had shown that the idea worked. A handful of ships had tasted its new power. Now the question became something harsher. Could a nation at war build these fragile, intricate devices in the numbers the front lines demanded? The answer did not lie in a single grand factory, but in a network of plants spread across the United States. Many of them were ordinary industrial buildings that had made civilian goods only a few years earlier. Their signs changed, their gates grew guarded, and their production lines were rebuilt for something that looked simple on paper but turned out to be extremely demanding. A proximity fuse was not a single piece of metal. It was a tiny radio set, a power source, and a safety system all compressed into the space of a large hand. Inside these factories, the workforce changed as well. Many experienced machinists and technicians had already gone into uniform. In their place came a wave of new workers, a very large number of them women. Some had never set foot on a factory floor before the war. They arrived from farms, towns, and cities, learned to wear protective clothing, learned to read gauges, and learned to hold their hands steady over delicate parts that could mean the difference between a working fuse and a useless one. Training programs grew quickly. New workers sat at benches practicing how to position tiny resistors, wrap wire around minute coils, or solder fragile joints without overheating them. Instructors explained how every connection mattered, how a cracked joint or a misplaced component might not only waste material but also fail at the worst possible moment over a distant ocean. The work demanded patience and focus rather than strength, but it was no less vital than any job at the front. Secrecy wrapped itself around everything they did. Official documents described the product in careful, vague language. Workers were often told only that they were assembling sensitive components for a special fuse. Many never saw a complete unit. Tasks were divided so that one team might build subassemblies, another might wire sockets, and another might cement glass tubes into place. Very few people saw the full design. This compartmented approach made it harder for any casual observer to understand exactly what was being produced. The physical security of the warehouses and assembly lines matched this invisible wall. Guards checked badges at gates. Windows were sometimes covered or frosted to limit outside views. Conversations about the details of the work were discouraged anywhere beyond the factory walls. The simple phrase "loose talk costs lives" was not an empty slogan in this environment. It was a daily reminder that the thing they were making had to remain a surprise for as long as possible. Despite all this, The atmosphere inside the plants was not purely grim. There was a sense of purpose that came from knowing their work traveled straight to ships and gun crews. Notice boards sometimes displayed letters or carefully edited reports from the front, describing how new fuses had helped defend a convoy or bring down attacking aircraft. Exact figures and locations were often removed, but the message remained clear. The small parts they held between their fingers mattered in a very large way. As production scaled up, engineers faced a new kind of difficulty. Devices that functioned well when built in dozens could misbehave when built in tens of thousands. Minor variations in parts, slight differences in assembly technique, or subtle changes in materials could show up as failures under the brutal test of gunfire. Quality control turned into a constant battle. Inspection stations sprang up at each stage of the line. Workers checked solder joints with magnifiers, measured voltages, and rejected any units that did not match the required standards. Some of the most important tests happened far from the factories themselves. Sample batches of completed fuses were shipped to proving grounds, where they were mounted in shells and fired from real guns. Observers tracked how many detonated as intended, how many failed, and under what conditions. The results flowed back to the production teams. When patterns of trouble appeared, small changes followed. A tiny change in a spring, a sturdier support for a vacuum tube, or a different sealing compound might raise the reliability by a few vital %. The numbers climbed steadily. What had begun as experimental lots of a few hundred grew into thousands, then millions. Over the course of the war, more than 20 million proximity fuses would be produced, a figure almost unimaginable to the scientists who had first sketched out the circuit diagrams. Each unit represented hours of work by multiple hands, careful planning by engineers, and a complicated supply chain that fed glass, metal, and chemicals into the factories on a strict schedule. Shipping presented its own challenges. The fuses had to reach magazines and depots around the world without damage. They could not be allowed to arm accidentally during transport, and they had to arrive with their batteries still fresh. Special containers and packing methods were developed to cushion them against vibration. In some cases, the fuses were installed into the shells at ammunition depots close to the ports, so that the most delicate steps happened near the end of the journey rather than at the very beginning. All of this happened under the constant shadow of fear that the enemy might discover exactly how the fuse worked. Military planners worried that if the design became widely known, countermeasures would follow. An enemy might coat aircraft with materials that absorbed or distorted radio signals, or release clouds of chaff designed to confuse the devices. These threats added urgency to the secrecy rules. Proximity fuses were held back from certain fronts at first, especially where a dud might fall on land and be recovered. The people on the production lines often never heard the full story. Many simply knew that they worked long shifts, sometimes 6 or 7 days a week, building something the War Department considered extremely important. Some lost brothers, husbands, or sons overseas during those same years, and they returned to their benches with the quiet determination that their work might protect someone else from the same fate. In photographs taken later, rows of women can be seen seated at benches in neat lines, faces lit by work lamps as they focus on tiny mechanisms. There is nothing dramatic about their posture, nothing that hints at heroism in the usual sense. Yet the devices that passed through their hands would soon stand between ships and incoming bombers, between cities and flying bombs, between frontline troops and sudden barrages of steel from above. By the middle of the war, crates filled with these compact radio fuses were moving across oceans and rail yards almost continuously. They were destined for ship magazines in the Pacific, for anti-aircraft batteries around vital harbors, and eventually for field artillery units on land. Most of the people who saw the crates had no idea how the devices inside actually functioned. They only knew that when installed and fired, something about their guns had changed. The factories themselves returned to quiet after each shift. Lights dimmed, assembly lines fell still, and the quiet hum of war work paused until the next morning. But the results of that labor did not rest. They traveled outward, hidden in steel shells and locked storage rooms, waiting for the moments when an approaching aircraft or a distant target would bring them suddenly and violently to life. By the time the new fuse had spread through the fleets in the Pacific, Another struggle was reaching a dangerous peak on the far side of the globe. In the winter of 1944, deep forests and small villages of the Ardennes became the stage for a last gamble by German forces. Snow covered the fields and roads. The sky was often low and gray. The front, which had seemed to be slowly pushing east, suddenly buckled under a surprise offensive. 4 months before that winter, the variable time fuse had been kept away from many European land operations. Planners feared that if shells using the new device landed unexploded on soil controlled by the enemy, curious technicians would eventually dig them up. The seas of the Pacific hid most duds beneath deep water. The fields and forests of Europe did not. As long as there were other options, the strange fuse that sensed its own targets remained mostly a naval and limited air defense secret. Pressure slowly eroded that caution. The air war over the United Kingdom had taken on a new shape. Instead of waves of piloted bombers, the islands now faced streams of pilotless flying bombs launched from the continent. These fast, small weapons buzzed toward cities at low altitude, guided not by crews but by simple machinery. They were hard to catch with fighters and difficult to hit with traditional gunnery. When variable time fuses were finally approved for use in some of the anti-aircraft guns defending London and other targets, the effect was dramatic. More and more of the incoming weapons exploded in the air before reaching their intended streets and buildings. That success added weight to the argument that ground forces on the continent needed the same advantage. Infantry and armored units were advancing into regions where the enemy could still concentrate troops for sudden counterattacks. Traditional artillery could break up those attacks, but only if the shells exploded in ways that reached soldiers using ditches, woods, and foxholes for cover. The variable time fuse, with its ability to trigger in mid-air rather than on impact, promised exactly that. So crates that had once gone almost exclusively to naval depots and coastal batteries began to appear in ammunition stocks assigned to field artillery brigades. Inside them were shells fitted with the same compact radio hearts that had guarded convoys and task forces. Gunners were briefed more carefully than usual. They were told they now held rounds with special fuses, more sensitive to rough handling and strictly controlled. They were taught how to set them, how to store them, and when to use them. The details of the internal design remained concealed beneath phrases like special type and restricted issue. When the German winter offensive burst through the snow-covered trees of the Ardennes, it hit some of these units before the new procedures had fully settled into routine. Columns of German troops and armor pushed along narrow roads and through woods, using bad weather to limit Allied air power. In the confusion of the first days, some Allied positions were overrun, some batteries had to fall back, and some dumps of ammunition were abandoned in haste. Among shells loaded on captured trucks or left in depots were examples of the very thing planners had hoped to keep away from enemy hands. Sometimes they were still crated and clean. Sometimes they had been fired but had failed to detonate, plunging into soft ground or deep snow instead. As the lines shifted, German search teams moved into these spaces, collecting equipment and supplies that might be turned around and used in their own operations. They gathered everything from canned food to fuel, from radios to boxes of shells. The strange nose assemblies on some of the captured rounds attracted particular attention from technical staff. In workshops behind the front, German ordnance specialists began to open the nose sections and lay out the contents on benches. What they found did not match their expectations. Instead of purely mechanical gears and springs, they saw a cluster of small glass tubes with shining electrodes inside, coils of fine wire, resistors, capacitors, and other parts that looked more like miniature radio receivers than anything that belonged in artillery. To those who had spent years around conventional fuses, it seemed almost like a mistake. Reports and analytical notes took shape under dim lamps. Some experts recalled earlier studies that had concluded glass vacuum tubes could never survive the shock of being fired from a gun of that size. They had seen test pieces shattered, circuits torn apart, and delicate filaments snapped by acceleration long before any successful design existed. To them, the idea that the enemy had somehow solved this problem seemed unlikely. The pieces on their tables appeared more like clever deception than practical engineering. Out of that mixture of experience and disbelief grew a dangerous conclusion. Many of the analysts examining the captured fuses decided that these must be decoy devices, perhaps made to impress or confuse, rather than functioning components. They reasoned that the tubes would surely break under launch forces, leaving the shell to behave like any ordinary round or fail outright. That judgment, repeated in internal reports, gave higher command a distorted picture of what the new ammunition could actually do. While those papers were being written, the front itself was starting to feel the real performance of the device. Allied units that had recoiled from the first shock of the offensive regrouped and counterattacked. Artillery officers began to use their variable-time fused shells more aggressively, especially against concentrations of troops moving in or out of wooded areas. Instead of aiming for craters in roads or on ridgelines, they set their fire missions to burst shells above tree level or just over open fields where enemy formations were advancing. To the soldiers on the receiving end, there was nothing theoretical about the results. Shells that once might have buried their explosions partly in the earth now detonated overhead, shredding branches and showering fragments downward in wide cones. Snow that had looked solid and untouched a moment earlier turned into a churned, darkened surface scattered with splinters and debris. Cover that might have been adequate against impact bursts no longer offered the same security. The mismatch between what enemy analysts believed on paper and what their front-line troops experienced in reality could not last forever. Rumors and scattered reports filtered back from units that had endured barrages with an unusually high proportion of airbursts. These accounts hinted that something had changed in Allied artillery practice. Yet even with such hints, the captured examples on workbenches still misled many of those trying to understand them. Their earlier assumptions about what was possible in electronics had dug deep grooves in their thinking. As winter dragged on and the offensive lost momentum, variable-time fuses quietly played a growing part in shaping the battlefield. They helped break up attacks, disrupt assembly areas, and make open ground more dangerous for any force trying to move quickly in daylight. The secret inside each shell remained the same, a delicate cluster of glass and wire that most enemy experts still considered unworkable. Far away from the snow and the clatter of tracked vehicles, the scientists and engineers who had once argued over circuit diagrams rarely had time to follow all these details. They received only fragments in official summaries, enough to show that their invention was now deeply involved in one of the largest land battles of the war. The device that some had once considered barely possible had become a quiet but sharp edge in a clash that might decide how long the conflict would last. While snow still lay thick over the European front, another kind of battle unfolded in the skies above Britain. The old terror of bomber formations had shifted into a new shape. Instead of aircraft flown by crews, long, narrow pilotless weapons roared across the channel, following simple guidance towards cities and ports. People on the ground learned to recognize their harsh buzzing sound. As long as that sound continued, there was hope. When it cut out, the weapon began its silent fall. These flying bombs, often called V1 weapons, traveled too fast and too low for many traditional defenses. Fighters could catch some of them, but not all. Conventional anti-aircraft shells, set to explode at guessed heights along their path, wasted too many bursts in empty air. It was in this environment that the proximity fuse moved from experimental weapon to central tool of survival. Around London and other vital targets, gun batteries stood ready along the likely approach paths. Crews had already endured years of air raids. Now they faced a different pattern. Radar stations and observers tracked the incoming weapons as they crossed the coast. Orders flashed to batteries as plots appeared on maps. Guns were swung into position, and magazines were filled with shells tipped by the new fuses. When the guns opened, the difference soon became visible to anyone watching the sky. Instead of bursts scattered far from the oncoming streaks, more explosions appeared dangerously close to the narrow shapes themselves. Each proximity fuse sent out a faint radio pulse and listened for the echo. As the flying bomb crossed through that invisible field, the changing reflection triggered an airburst at just the right distance. The resulting cloud of fragments did not need a direct impact. A near miss became enough. Statisticians and officers later studied the numbers. They saw a clear pattern. Batteries equipped with proximity-fused shells destroyed a far higher share of the incoming weapons than those using older timed rounds. On many days, close to 4 out of 5 of the flying bombs aimed at certain defended zones were shot down before reaching their targets. For civilians who heard explosions in the sky instead of on the streets, the effect of this quiet electronic brain inside each shell was both abstract and deeply personal. The same technology traveled outward with fleets and convoys. On the wide ocean, ships had become used to the sight of attacking aircraft diving through clouds of flak, sometimes surviving long enough to release their bombs or crash deliberately into hulls and decks. As the war shifted toward its later stages in the Pacific, a new and desperate form of attack emerged with full force. Pilots guided their aircraft on one-way missions, turning plane and bomb into a single weapon aimed directly at ships. These attacks demanded almost instant response. A single determined aircraft, even if riddled with holes, could still cause devastation if it kept enough speed and control to strike. Proximity fuses gave naval gunners a new edge at exactly the moment they needed it most. Instead of relying on perfect predictions of height and timing, the shells could adapt in flight, sensing when they were close enough to fill the air around an incoming plane with lethal fragments. Operations around islands such as Okinawa brought this reality into sharp focus. Task forces and supporting ships operated under near constant threat from waves of attackers. Radar would pick up incoming groups. Alarms sounded across decks. Crews rushed to battle stations, eyes scanning the horizon and the low clouds. Every speck that separated itself from the sky carried the potential of fire and wreckage. On radar picket ships stationed far from the main formations, the danger was even greater. Their role was to provide early warning, which meant they often faced the first and fiercest attacks. Many of these ships were destroyers, smaller and more exposed than the heavy carriers and battleships they guarded. For them, the improved performance of their anti-aircraft guns with proximity-fused shells could mean the difference between survival and sudden loss. When the first attacking wave appeared, guns did what they had always done at sea. Barrels elevated, mounts traversed, and shells streaked upward. Yet the pattern of bursts had changed. Airbursts now formed in tight clusters around the paths of the incoming aircraft rather than in rough curtains that left gaps. Some attackers lost wings, engines, or control surfaces before they could reach their chosen targets. Others lumbered onward, damaged and burning, only to splash down short of the ships. Crews noticed this difference even if they did not fully understand the electronics behind it. They saw that fewer attackers made it through unscathed. They watched planes come apart under airbursts that seemed almost uncannily well placed. For sailors on deck, the effect of years of laboratory work and factory effort appeared as brief, violent flashes in the sky and falling wreckage on the water. Despite this, the battle was never simple or one-sided. Kamikaze pilots were often willing to press their dives through terrifying walls of fire. Even with proximity fuses, no defense could stop every aircraft. Ships still burned and sank. Yet the number of attackers needed to inflict that damage rose sharply. Instead of one in a handful striking home, more and more were cut down before reaching their mark. In a war of attrition fought over long distances and limited resources, that shift mattered deeply. Detailed reports from these actions described just how much more effective the new shells were compared to the old. In many cases, the probability of destroying or disabling an attacking aircraft per round fired improved by a factor of 3 or more. This meant fewer shells had to be expended for each successful defense, a crucial advantage when magazines were finite and resupply routes were long and dangerous. The psychological weight of this change also spread quietly through the fleets. Gun crews who had once felt that they were throwing up almost random walls of steel now sensed that their actions were more closely linked to real results. Commanders could plan operations with slightly greater confidence that their ships could withstand concentrated air attack, at least for critical periods. None of this removed the inherent danger of operating within range of determined enemies, but it shifted the balance of risk. From high above, if an observer could have watched the pattern of combat over cities and seas in those years, they would have seen an invisible thread tying together London's gun belts and the Pacific picket lines. That thread was a line of radio energy pulsing from millions of shells, each tiny signal waiting for a reflection that meant lethal proximity. The same principle that had once seemed barely possible in a quiet laboratory now shaped the fates of convoys, islands, and crowded neighborhoods. Even as these successes accumulated, the full story remained known to only a limited circle. To most of those who benefited, the proximity fuse was simply a new kind of ammunition that seemed to work better. Few of the civilians who slept through nights of distant skybists, and few of the sailors who watched burning aircraft fall short into the waves, knew exactly how that improvement had been achieved. They only saw its effects in the enemies who never arrived.